Namaskaram. Today I'm going to be talking about the 8th paragraph of Nāṉ Ār. In the 8th and 9th paragraphs, Bhagavan talks about other spiritual practices and about how they can be an aid, but at the same time they are inadequate by themselves. So that is the main subject of paragraphs 8 and 9. Paragraph 8 is particularly about pranayama. Pranayama means control, breath restraint, we can say it simply. Before starting the paragraph, I'll just refer back to the 6th paragraph, because the first sentence of the 6th paragraph is Bhagavan says more or less the same thing in the first sentence of the 8th paragraph. What he said in the first sentence of the 6th paragraph was Nāṇ Ār vicharane inalaye manam adangam. That means only by the investigation, who am I, will the mind cease. Likewise, in the first sentence of this 8th paragraph, he says, Manam adangavadaku, for the mind to cease, vicharanaye tavira, except vicharana, that's except self-investigation, vera tahunta upayangal illai. There are no other adequate means. Here, that is in both these sentences, the verb he uses for the subsidence or cessation of the mind is adangam. This is a verb that has a range of meanings. So the exact meaning has to be understood from the context. In the first sentence of the 6th paragraph, and again in this first sentence, when he uses the word adangam, what he implies is the permanent cessation of the mind. The mind will permanently cease. Just to give you a brief idea of the range of meanings of adangam, according to the Tamil lexicon, adangu means to obey, yield, submit, or be subdued. To shrink or become compressed, to cease, or come to a standstill, to settle, subside like dust, to disappear as a heavenly body. For example, when the sun sets, you can say adangam. To be still as the mind of a sage. So the general idea of adangu is subsidence, and it also can mean dissolution, dissolving. So in this context, what Bhagavan is talking about when he says that it's only by the investigation, who am I, the mind will adangu, and it is for the mind to adangu, it is only, there's no other adequate means except vichara. There he's referring to a permanent cessation of mind. In other words, a permanent dissolution, a permanent eradication of the mind. But he uses the same verb in other sentences, talking about temporary dissolution. So just to clarify that. Why does Bhagavan say this? I mean, this is an idea that, as I say, it's the first... it's an idea he expresses in the first sentence of the 6th paragraph and in the first sentence of this paragraph. And he expresses similar ideas elsewhere in this work and in so many other places. There is a reason for this. That is, when he talks about the mind, not always, but generally, he's referring to ego. That is, the mind, the term mind sometimes refers to the totality of all thoughts. But all thoughts, other than the first thought I, are objects, whereas the first thought I is the subject. So no other thoughts couldn't exist without the I thought, because the I thought, the thought called I, is the thought, is what thinks all other thoughts. So what the mind essentially is this first thought I, which is ego. So when he uses the term mind, he's referring to ego, not always, but generally. So the nature of ego is to rise, stand, and flourish by attending to things other than itself, as he implies in verse 25 of Untitled, in which he says, grasping form, it comes into existence. Grasping form, it stands. Grasping and feeding on forms, it flourishes abundantly. Since he says in that same verse that ego is a formless phantom, grasping form means grasping things other than itself. And the mind cannot stand without grasping other things, as he said, for example, in the end of the fourth paragraph of Nāṉ Ār, he says, Manam epodum ostulite anusarite nikom. That literally means the mind stands only by always going after something gross. Going after here means holding on to it. So the nature of the mind is to always hold things other than itself. In other words, to attend to things other than itself. So long as we are attending to anything other than ourselves, we are thereby nourishing and sustaining ego. Because attention to other things is the food on which ego lives. So that's why he says in the third sentence of verse 25 of Untitled, grasping and feeding on forms, it flourishes abundantly. So long as we are attending to anything other than ourselves, we are thereby sustaining ego. Why? Because the very nature of ego is to always be aware of things other than itself. So if we didn't attend to other things, we would cease to be aware of other things, and therefore ego would thereby subside. It would cease. It would dissolve back into the source from which it rose. The source from which it rose is the pure awareness that we actually are. The pure awareness that alone remains in sleep, but which exists even now as the adhisthana, as the ground or the support for the appearance of all other things. So since the mind is nourished and sustained by attending to anything other than itself, it will cease to exist only when it attends to itself. That is one thing. The other thing is the mind or ego is a false awareness of ourself. That is, as ego, we are always aware of ourselves as I am this body. This body is not what we actually are, but it's what we seem to be. Well, this body here doesn't mean the particular body we now experience as I, because in waking we experience this body as I. In other dreams we experience other bodies as I. So the body is not always the same body, but whenever we rise as ego, we are aware of ourselves as a body, and we are consequently aware of other things. So ego is a false awareness of ourselves, because this body is not what we actually are. Therefore, in order to eradicate a false awareness, the only means is correct awareness. So we need to be aware of ourselves as we actually are. So long as we're attending to other things, we seem to be ego. Therefore, we need to attend only to ourselves in order to see what we actually are. We need to attend to ourselves so keenly that we cease to be aware of anything else. This is the reason why he says that it's only by this investigation, this self-attentiveness, that the mind will permanently cease. And why he said that's in the first sentence of the sixth paragraph. In this sentence, he says, first sentence of this paragraph, eighth paragraph, he says, for the mind to cease, except vicharana, that means except self-investigation, there is no other adequate means. And then in the next sentence, he says, matra upayangalinal adanginal. If made to cease by other means, manam adanginal pol irindu, the mind remaining as if it had ceased, that implies that it will temporarily remain be like that. Marapadium kilambividum, it will rise again. So though we can bring about a temporary cessation or dissolution of the mind by other means, it will only be for a while that it will remain like that, because sooner or later it will rise again. And then in the next sentence, he says, pranayama talam manam adangam. Even by pranayama, the mind will cease. It's interesting to compare this sentence with the first sentence of the 6th paragraph, which I referred to earlier. There he says that is the subject and main verb of both sentences is manam adangam, the mind will cease. There, in the 6th paragraph, he says, only by the investigation the mind will cease. And here he says, even by pranayama the mind will cease. This could seem to be a contradiction. This is why we need to understand that when he talks about the mind, when he uses this verb adangam, with reference to any other practice, he's talking about the temporary cessation of mind, temporary dissolution of mind. Whereas what he means in that first sentence of the 6th paragraph and in the first sentence of this paragraph is the permanent dissolution of mind will be brought about only by self-investigation. So what we have to understand from these sentences is that the mind will subside by pranayama, but it will only subside temporarily. Sooner or later, it will rise again. To understand this, it is useful to refer to verses 11 to 14 of Upadeshundya, because there, likewise, he's talking about the path of yoga, and the path of yoga means the path of Raja Yoga, Patanjali's yoga, and one of the principal practices in the path of yoga is pranayama. That is because it is a very effective means to bring about a temporary, initially it can bring about a calming down of the mind, and if one practices, one perseveres in practice, you can bring about the complete but temporary dissolution of mind. In other words, that is what is called manolaya, or the term they use in yoga is nirvikalpa samadhi. Nirvikalpa samadhi is a state like sleep in which the mind has completely dissolved into its source, but only temporarily. Whereas in the difference between sleep and nirvikalpa samadhi is in sleep, we subside in sleep due to tiredness. The mind subsides in nirvikalpa samadhi due to some artificial means, such as pranayama. Because it's brought about deliberately, that if the yogi who is practicing pranayama in order to bring about nirvikalpa samadhi does so deliberately. So when the yogi wakes up from nirvikalpa samadhi, the nirvikalpa samadhi seems to the yogi to be different to the state of sleep. That is, from the perspective of the yogi, sleep seems to be a state of darkness, whereas nirvikalpa seems to be a state of light. This is only from this seeming distinction is only from the perspective of the mind in waking or dream, not in the actual experience of nirvikalpa samadhi and sleep are exactly the same, because all differences appear only in the view of the mind. In the absence of the mind, there are no differences. That is why Bhagavan warned against trying to any practices that would or pursuing any practice far enough but will lead to Nirvikalpa Samadhi. And as always, when Bhagavan warns against things, he does it in a very gentle way. And not everyone grasps what Bhagavan is saying. That is whenever Bhagavan warned against this, he used to tell the story of a yogi who was practicing pranayama on the banks of the Ganga. And he had been practicing this pranayama for many years, so he had become very adept in the practice. So he would go into Nirvikalpa Samadhi for long periods of time. And because he was much of his time in Nirvikalpa Samadhi, the local people all thought he's a great sage. And one disciple came and was serving him faithfully, hoping that he could also learn how to attain this lofty state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi as he viewed it. One day, when the yogi had been for a prolonged period in Nirvikalpa Samadhi, he woke up. And because he'd been in that state for a long time, he was thirsty. So he asked his disciple to go and fetch water from the Ganga. The Ganga was flowing very nearby, so it would take the disciple just a few minutes to go and get a small cup of water. But by the time he returned, the yogi had gone back into Samadhi, into Nirvikalpa Samadhi. And this time, he remained in that state for 300 years. So in those 300 years, obviously his disciple died. Everyone forgot about this sage who was there. The jungle grew up around him. And in the meanwhile, the Ganga had changed its course. So instead of being just nearby his hut, it was now several miles away. And after 300 years, he woke up. And the first thing he did when he woke up was to angrily ask, "Where's my water?" What Bhagavan said about this is the last thought that was in his mind before he went into Nirvikalpa Samadhi was the first thought that came out. That means even the most superficial thought in the mind was not destroyed in spite of remaining for 300 years in Nirvikalpa Samadhi. So when even that most superficial thought is not destroyed, that clearly implies none of the vasanas are destroyed. So remaining in Nirvikalpa Samadhi is from a perspective of spiritual progress, it is no more use than remaining in sleep. In sleep, we remain several hours every day in sleep, but our vasanas are not thereby destroyed. Why is that? Vasanas are our inclinations to think about this or that, to attend to this or that. So the vasanas come alive, so to speak, only in waking and dream. That is, only when ego rises, that is, the vasanas are ego's inclinations. So only when we rise as ego do we feel inclination to think about this or think about that. When we're in sleep, we are not troubled by any vasanas, any inclination. We don't feel inclined to think about anything. Why? Because ego is absent. In the absence of ego, there are no vasanas, because vasanas, obviously, it's only ego who has vasanas. So in the absence of ego, its vasanas are also absent. So remain, just like sleep, Nirvikalpa Samadhi is a state of manolaya. That's a state in which ego has dissolved back into its source. So there are no inclinations functioning there. So since their inclinations are not functioning, we cannot overcome them. In waking and dream, we can weaken some inclinations and cultivate and strengthen other inclinations by practice. For example, most of our vasanas, well, almost all our vasanas are what are called Vishaya vasanas, that inclinations to attend to Vishayas. Vishayas means any objects or phenomena. In other words, anything other than ourselves is a Vishaya. So our inclination to attend to anything other than ourselves is a Vishaya vasana. The opposite of a Vishayavasana is Satvasana. Sat means being. So the inclination just to be, in other words, the inclination to know and to be what we really are, that is what is called Satvasana. When we are practicing self-investigation in the waking or dream states, we are not allowing ourselves to be swayed by our Vishaya vasanas and allowing ourselves to be swayed only by the Satvasana. So since we are thereby cultivating and developing and strengthening the Satvasana and weakening the other vasanas. This we can do in waking and dream. We cannot do so in sleep or in any state of laya. So this sadhu, who remained in that state of that the reason Bhagavan so often told this story is to drive home the point that being in Nirvikalpa Samadhi is of no use. It's a state like sleep. It's just a temporary dissolution of mind. So, as I say, but in yoga, the principal one of the principal practices of yoga is pranayama, because it's a very powerful means to bring about a temporary cessation of mind. So this is what Bhagavan explains in verses 11 to 14 of Upadesha Undiyar. What he says in verse 11 is, when one restrains the breath within, like a bird caught in a net, the mind will also be restrained. This is a means to restrain. In other words, if we want to bring about a subsidence of the mind, or if we want to restrain the outgoing activity of the mind, one means is to restrain the breath. This is a simple fact that we can observe. If someone is very excited, and in other words, their mind is very active, the breath, they will be breathing fast. If a person, for example, we have a saying in English, it took my breath away. If you hear some shocking news, or you suddenly see something, a beautiful scenery or something, oh, it took my breath away, that means it brought about, but by stilling your mind, it thereby stilled the breath. So if we reduce the activity of the mind, we thereby reduce the activity of the breath, and vice versa. If we restrain the breath, we thereby restrain the mind. So this is why it's a basic technique in yoga. But because yoga, the aim in yoga, as it said in the first of the Yoga Sutras, yoga's first or second, I can't remember which, but this is where the teaching of the yoga, that is the fundamental principle in which potentially yoga is based, is yoga's chitta vritti nirodha. Yoga is curbing or restraining the chitta vritti, the activities of the mind. So the aim of yoga is to bring about, is to reduce the activities of the mind, and eventually to make all mental activity cease. So because of that, pranayama is one of their principal means. Then in the next verse, verse 12 of Upadesha Undiyar, Bhagavan explains this in a little bit more, a little bit further. He says, mind and breath are two branches which have knowing and doing, that implies that the respective functions of the mind and the breath are knowing and doing. That is, the function of the mind is to know things. The breath, though he talks here about breath, that is, breath is one of the Sanskrit word prana, though it's often translated as breath, it actually means life. Why it's generally equated with breath is one of the main physiological manifestations of life in the body is breathing. That is one of the principles there are other physiological functions. That is, it is said there are 5 pranas. I can't remember what the 5 pranas are, but they are things like digestion and elimination of waste matter and so on. These are things that can be temporarily stopped, but we can't stop for long. We can't stop breathing for long. That breathing seems to us to be the most essential thing. We have to be breathing all the time. So, and it's also the easiest function to control. Under our control, at least to a certain extent, we can hold our breath, at least for a minute or two. And if you're skilled at pranayama, you can slow down the breathing to a considerable extent, which is why some yogis, like in the story told by Bhagavan, that yogi, his body remained alive for 300 years. Why? Because of his mastery of pranayama, he was able to slow down his breath, and consequently all the other physiological functions, the heartbeat and everything, slowed down to such an extent that they could remain for a considerable length of time. So, I mean, I believe that yogis have demonstrated how they can not only reduce their breathing to a very considerable extent, they can thereby reduce their heart rate and other things. All these things are possible if one's mind has an inclination to go in that direction. So, so what Bhagavan is saying here, the function of the mind is knowing. The function of breath and the other pranas is doing. That is, the body is active only when there's life in it. So all activities, in fact, not only activities of the body, activities of the mind also, they depend upon the prana. Because if the prana stops, everything stops. So mind and breath, they're 2 branches. The function of the mind is knowing, and the function of breath is doing. And then he says their mula, that's their root or base or foundation, is one. That is, it's like a tree which has 2 trunks, or two that is from near the ground level, 2 branches sprout out. So those 2 branches are mind and breath, but the root is one. Why is this relevant? Because this is to explain why if you restrain one, you restrain the other. Sadhguru used to give an analogy. Supposing you have a room with a light bulb and a fan, but they're both controlled by one switch. If you turn down if you want to, it's not an on-off switch. It's one of those switches that you can reduce the light. So if you want to reduce the light, you can turn it down, and by reducing the light, you're also reducing the speed of a fan. Or if you want to reduce the speed of a fan, you can't reduce the speed of a fan without thereby reducing the light. So it is like that. If we restrain the activity, the thinking of the mind, we thereby restrain the activity of breath. And if we restrain the activity of the breath, we thereby restrain the activity of the mind. That is the idea. Then in verse 13, so having explained the efficacy of pranayama, Bhagavan then comes on to, not explicitly, but implicitly, to point out what is the problem with pranayama, what is the limitation of pranayama. That in verse 13, he says, dissolution is two. That means this implies dissolution is of 2 kinds, laya and nasa. What is lying down, that means what is in layer, will rise. If its form dies, it will not rise. In other words, what Bhagavan is pointing out here is that dissolution of mind is of two kinds: laya, which is temporary, and nasa, which is permanent. So if any other than complete eradication of ego, in other words, manonasa, any other form of dissolution of the mind is only temporary, whether it's sleep or coma or death or nirvikalpa samadhi or whatever. However, if a dissolution of the mind is brought about by any means other than self-investigation, it will only be temporary, because though the ego has dissolved back into its source, it hasn't been destroyed, so sooner or later it will rise again. So that's why he says, the dissolution is of two kinds: laya, which is temporary dissolution, and nasa, which is permanent dissolution or annihilation. What is dissolved in laya will rise, but if it dies in nasa, it will not rise. It's the implication. Then in verse 14, that Bhagavan often used to warn people, if you are practicing pranayama, it's okay to practice pranayama up to a certain extent, but don't let it go on to a point that brings about nirvikalpa samadhi, because nirvikalpa samadhi is just a state of manolaya. You don't achieve anything by that. So if you want to use pranayama, that is, some people are very attracted to such yoga practices, or they've been practicing them for a long time. Bhagavan said, okay, fine. If you want to do that, do it, but make use of the quiescence of mind that you can achieve by pranayama. Don't take the quiescence to such an extent that it ends in laya, nirvikalpa samadhi. Take it, bring about, that is, use your pranayama to subdue the excessive activity of the mind. Then when the mind is calm, instead of continuing to follow pranayama, then turn the mind back to face inwards, to face yourself. And because that is the only means by which it will die. This Bhagavan often used to explain. This is what he expresses in a very brief form in this verse. What he says is, only when one sends the mind, which will become calm when one restrains the breath, on the investigating path, will its form perish. That means that the implication is that if we practice pranayama to a certain extent, so that the mind is made relatively calm, then we should direct the attention back towards ourselves, and then only will the mind die. The term he uses here for investigating path is avari. That can be interpreted in two ways. That is, awe is a verb that means to know or investigate. So in poetry, often relative or adjectival participles you don't have to follow the grammar strictly. So awe is the root of the verb. It's here used in the sense of the relative participle, aurum. So aurum vari means investigating path. Avari is an abbreviated form of aurum vari. That is one meaning. The other meaning is the adjective one is oru. Or before a vowel, it becomes awe. But in poetry, you can use awe even before a consonant. So here it's used before a consonant. So here avari can also mean the one path. But whichever way we interpret it, whether we interpret it as the one path or the investigating path, it amounts to the same, because according to Bhagavan, the one and only path by which the mind will be destroyed is this path of self-investigation. So it's what he's referring to here, whichever way we interpret, or whether we take it to mean one or investigating, either way, what is implied is the path of self-investigation. In other words, We can use pranayama to bring about a partial subsidence of the mind, but before the mind becomes subsides completely in nirvikalpa samadhi, we should send it on the investigating path. This is something that's very, very important to understand, because many people think that the aim when we're practicing self-investigation is just to experience quietness of mind. That is not our aim. The aim of self-investigation is to know what we actually are. And to know what we actually are, we need to be self-attentive. Merely achieving a temporary quiescence of mind is of little or no use. And if the quiescence goes to the extent of laya, of nirvikalpa samadhi, then it's absolutely no use. So Bhagavan never recommended that we should try and quieten the mind. In the previous paragraph of Nāṉ Ār, not the previous, but one paragraph of Nāṉ Ār that we spoke about last month, in one place Bhagavan says, if other thoughts rise, without trying to complete them, it is necessary to investigate to whom they have occurred. However many thoughts rise, what does it matter? Or so what? So Bhagavan isn't concerned about the rising of thoughts. If thoughts rise, we should investigate to whom it's arisen. In other words, whenever any thought rises, we should turn our attention back to ourselves, because we are the one to whom the thought has appeared. So our aim isn't just stopping thoughts in self-investigation. If we cling firmly to self-attentiveness, thereby thoughts will be stopped. But that is a byproduct. That is not our aim. Our aim is only attending to ourselves. Because it's only by attending to ourselves that that is the only means by which we can know ourselves as we actually are. And only by knowing ourselves as we actually are can we bring about the permanent dissolution of ego. That's why Bhagavan says in this verse 14 of Upadesha India, only when one sends the mind on the investigating path will its form perish. That is, what he says in this verse is, Odaka valiye odungum ulute. That means the mind which is restrained, or which becomes calm when the breath is restrained. If one sends that mind, ulate vidikave. Vidikave means only if one sends that mind on the path of investigation, vium adonuru, its form will die. So basically, Bhagavan is saying the same here, but he implied in the first sentence but he said explicitly in the first sentence of the 6th paragraph of Nāṉ Ār and the first sentence of this 8th paragraph. And it's only by self-investigation that the mind will cease permanently. So, as I said, he says here, even by pranayama, the mind will cease. So I'm now back on that's the 3rd sentence of this 8th paragraph. I went on a bit of a digression, but it's relevant to what follows. And what Bhagavan says in those, if we understand those 4 verses, 11 to 14 of Upadesha India, it helps to understand what Bhagavan is talking about here. So, as I say, in the 3rd sentence, he says, pranayama talum manamadangam. Even by pranayama, the mind will cease. Anal, the 4th sentence, he begins anal, but, or however. Pranam adangi irukam varayel. So long as the prana remains subsided, manamum adangirandu, the mind will also remain subsided. Pranam beli padam podu, tanam beli patu. That when the prana emerges, it, meaning the mind, will also emerge. Velipattu, vasane vayatal alayam, will emerge and wander under the sway of its vasanas. often in Bhagavan's teachings, he may be talking about a particular subject. Like here, he's talking about pranayama. But while talking about pranayama, he gives us very useful clues which have implications far beyond the subject that he's talking about. That is, from the perspective of, I mean, most of us are probably not practicing pranayama, and it's not at all necessary to practice pranayama in order to practice self-investigation, because the most effective means to restrain the mind is to be self-attentive. When we are self-attentive, we are thereby automatically restraining the breath, though we won't be aware of it because we won't be attending to it. So pranayama is not at all necessary in Bhagavan's path. These are teachings given for those whose minds are already, who've either been practicing these things or whose minds are inclined to go in that direction. So, but for those of us who are following the path of self-investigation and self-surrender as taught by Bhagavan, he gives a very valuable pointer in this sentence. That is, when the mind emerges, in other words, when the mind rises, it wanders under the sway of its vasanas. That is, the nature of the mind is such. So long as we are attending to ourselves, if we are holding fast to self-attentiveness, we are thereby not being swayed by our Vishaya vasanas. But as soon as we allow our mind to go away from ourselves towards any other thing, we are under the sway of our Vishaya vasanas to a greater or lesser extent. That is, why do we attend to any other things? Because we have an inclination to attend to them. That inclination to attend to other things is what is called Vishaya vasana. So as soon as our attention goes away from ourselves, we are under the sway of our Vishaya vasanas. Under the sway of our Vishaya vasanas does not mean that we are totally at their mercy. That is, the vasanas are our inclinations. So we are free to either to follow our inclinations or not to follow them. In fact, we have so many inclinations, and often our inclinations draw us in different directions. We may be inclined to do a certain thing, but we know it's not good for us. So we're inclined to do it, and we're also inclined to avoid doing it. This is very, very common, right? That is, so many things, so many inclinations rise in our mind, and we have a choice whether to follow this inclination or to follow some other inclination, even the contrary inclination. So we are not a slave to our vasanas, but we are under their sway to a greater or lesser extent, so long as we allow our mind to go away from ourselves. There are two places in Nāṉ Ār where Bhagavan uses the same expression about vasana vayatai. That means under the sway of vasanas. In the 19th paragraph of Nāṉ Ār, Bhagavan is talking about the mind. And often we see people and we say, oh, this person is a good person or this person is a bad person. Bhagavan says there are not two minds, namely a good mind and a bad mind. Mind is only one. Only vasanas are of two kinds, namely subha and asubha. That is, subha and asubha vasanas, all are Vishaya vasanas, but so we all have Vishaya vasanas, but some of us have Vishaya vasanas that are more harmful, and some of our Vishaya vasanas are more harmful, and some are less harmful. That is, even good people who are kind, generous, compassionate, helpful, they still have vasanas, but their vasanas are of a more agreeable type. Whereas other people who also have vasanas, but they are mean and selfish and backbiting and whatever, those are asubha vasanas. So even the Vishaya vasanas we can classify as of course, there's not It's not a simple matter of black and white. Some are more subha, some are more asubha. So, but what Bhagavan says is, when the mind is under the sway of subha vasanas, it is said to be a good mind, and when it is under the sway of asubha vasanas, a bad mind. So what Bhagavan is saying here is that the mind is neutral. The mind is neither good nor bad. It's the vasanas that are good and bad. And when the mind is under the sway of good vasanas, it appears to be a good mind. And when it's under the sway of bad vasanas, it's said to be a bad mind. And then he concludes by saying, however bad other people may appear to be, disliking them is not appropriate. Likes and dislikes are both to be disliked. They're both fit to be disliked. So here, like, as in this 8th paragraph, here Bhagavan talks about the mind under the sway of vasanas. So this is, as I say, so long the mind is, it is the nature of ego to have vasanas. That is, vasanas are not the nature, that is, it's the nature of mind, ego or mind, to have vasanas. That is, the vasanas are not the ego, but the ego is never present without vasanas. And so long as we allow our attention to go away from ourselves, the mind is under the sway of vishaya vasanas of one kind or another, whether good vishaya vasanas or bad vishaya vasanas. It's all relative. Because when we're following this spiritual path, this path of self-investigation and self-surrender, all vishaya vasanas are bad. So when we talk about subha and asubha, these are just relative terms. But all vasanas, any inclination to attend to anything other than ourselves is bad. The only good vasana is the sat vasana, the inclination to attend to ourselves. So if whenever we are not attending to ourselves, we are under the sway of vishaya vasanas of one kind or another. But as I say, we are not bound by we are not bound to follow our inclinations. You will have inclinations to do good things, bad things, but we don't necessarily have to follow our inclinations. This is where freedom of will comes. That if the vasanas are the seeds of our likes, dislikes, desires, attachments, and so on. So in other words, the vasanas are the will in its seed form. But do we have freedom of will? Yes, we do, because we are not bound to follow our inclination. That is, we can choose either to follow a certain inclination or not to follow it. And since inclinations are constantly rising in our mind, and those inclinations I may be inclined to lie in bed a little longer early in the morning, but I also may be inclined to get up and start working because I've got a lot of work to do. So there are contrary inclinations. We are free to choose which inclination to follow. Or we're equally well free to avoid following any vishaya vasanas and follow only the sat vasana by clinging to self-attentiveness. So we have that freedom. That freedom is, if we didn't have that freedom, no spiritual practice of any kind would be possible. So Bhagavan made it very clear. We have that freedom. We are not bound by though the nature of the mind is to always wander under the sway of its vasanas, it is not bound by its vasanas. As I say, this isn't the main subject that Bhagavan is talking about here. But I mean, he could have just said in this sentence, however, so long as the prana remains subsided, mind will also remain subsided. And when prana emerges, the mind will also emerge. He could have said that. But he added this very important point. When the mind emerges, its nature is it emerges under the sway of its vasanas, and consequently, having emerged, it then wanders under the sway of its vasanas. So indirectly, Bhagavan is indicating to us here that our aim should be to weaken the vasanas so that we don't. We aren't swayed by them. That is the implication we should draw from this. And pranayama is a forced control, a forced means of restraint. It isn't restraining the vasanas. In fact, if you're practicing pranayama, you're developing another type of vasana, the inclination to practice pranayama, to enjoy that calmness of mind that is brought about by pranayama. That is yet another Vishaya vasana, because even the calmness of mind that the yogi enjoys is itself a Vishaya. Of course, if he goes into Nirvikalpa Samadhi, then that is dissolution of the mind, so there's no Vishayas there. But any partial quiescence of mind brought about by pranayama, which may be very peaceful and enjoyable and pleasant, is itself a Vishaya. It's something that appears and disappears. It's not what is real. Our aim is only to pursue what is real. What is real is only I am. Then in the next sentence, Bhagavan says, then he begins to explain, as he explained in, particularly in verse 12 of Upadeshundya, why the restraining the breath brings about restraint of the mind. Here he explains the same thing, but in a slightly different way. He's explaining it here, but essentially it's the same. So in the next sentence he says, Manatikum prananakum pirapidum andre. The birthplace, both for mind and for prana, is one. Birthplace, this is a pirapidum. Bhagavan had used this term in the 5th paragraph and in the 6th paragraph. Essentially, it means the source, the place from which the mind rises. What is the place from which the mind rises? It is only our own real nature, pure awareness. So the source of both the mind and the prana is one. This is similar to what he said in verse 12 of Upadeshundya, but the mind and breath are two branches, but their root is one. Then in the next sentence he says, so having established that they both arise from the same source, he then begins to talk, to analyze what mind is in a little bit more detail. In the next sentence he says, Ninebe manatin sarupam. Thought alone is the swarupa of the mind. Swarupa, it means the actual nature, the very form of the mind. So what the mind actually is just thoughts. But as he says in the next sentence, Nānenam ninebe manatin mudal ninebu. So though thought collectively is mind, but thought called I alone is the first thought of the mind, is what he says in this sentence. This is something that Bhagavan often repeated, but of all the thoughts that rise in the mind, the thought called I is the first thought. He says this in verse 18 of Upadeshundya. He says it in the 5th paragraph of Nāṉ Ār, which we dealt with back in April. So of all the thoughts that rise in mind, the first thought is this thought called I. Aduve ahankaram. That is what Bhagavan means when he talks about the thought called I is only ego. What this sentence means is Aduve ahankaram means it alone is ego. It here is referring to the thought called I. So the first thought of the mind is the thought called I, which is what is otherwise called ego. From where ego arises, from there alone, the breath also rises up. So again, he's saying what he said in the earlier sentence. The birthplace for both for mind and for prana is one. Here he's saying from where ego rises, in other words, from the birthplace or from the source of the ego. So from the place where ego rises or from the source from which ego rises, from there alone, the breath also rises up. That is, as soon as, though they rise together, the root cause of the appearance of everything is ego. Because as Bhagavan says, for example, in verse 26 of Ulujunaptu, if ego comes into existence, everything comes into existence. If ego doesn't exist, everything doesn't exist. So ego is the root cause for everything. But whenever ego rises, it projects and grasps the body as I. So, and whenever we rise as ego, we experience ourselves as I am this body. And when we experience a body as I, as Bhagavan clarified, that in this context, body doesn't mean just the gross form of a body. Because when we experience a body as I, we never experience a dead body as I. So it's always a living body. So it's not just the physical form, it's also the life, the prana, that animates that form. And we also never experience a sleeping body as I. Whenever we experience a body as I, we're either in waking or in dream, which according to Bhagavan are one of the same. They're both just dream state. So whenever we experience a body as I, it's a living body and it's a awake body. Because it's living, the prana is there. And because it's awake, the mind, intellect, and will are functioning there. So all these five together, these are the five sheaves. And whenever ego rises, it projects and grasps all these five sheaves. So as soon as ego rises, it experiences itself as a body, and that body is alive. So the prana is there. That's why when the source from which ego rises is also the source from which all the five sheaths rise, including the prana. That's the implication. And then he draws a conclusion from this. Therefore, when the mind ceases, again he uses this verb adangam. So ceases can mean it can be talk about dissolution or even or partial subsidence. So therefore, when the mind ceases, subsides, or disappears, the prana also ceases. And when the prana ceases, the mind also ceases. So by restraining the prana, we bring about a subsidence of a reduction in the activity of the mind, and therefore a subsidence of ego. And by restraining the mind, we also bring about the cessation of the subsidence of the breath. This is where that analogy given by Sadhu Om of one switch being used to control both a light and a fan. If you've got only one switch to control the two, you cannot reduce the activity of one without reducing the activity of the other. So if you want to dim the light, you have to reduce the speed of the fan. And if you want to reduce the speed of the fan, you have to dim the light. And or vice versa, if you want the light bright, you have to have the fan going fast. And if you want the fan going fast, you have to have the light bright, because there's only one switch controlling them. So that's a very nice analogy to illustrate this relationship between the activity of the mind and the activity of the breath. There are three sentences which are now included at this point, which I will discuss later, because they were not part of the original. They were not part of any of the answers that Bhagavan gave to Shiva Prakashan Pillai, and they were also not in the essay, but Bhagavan, the essay form, which we're now discussing, the essay form of Nāṉ Ār, the essay version of Nāṉ Ār, which Bhagavan wrote about 1926 or 27. The earliest version of Nāṉ Ār, in which I've seen these three sentences, was from about 1936. So I think it was possibly added first in the question and answer version and later in the essay version, as far as I'm aware. But because those are not part of the original, what Bhagavan actually wrote in the original essay written by Bhagavan, I will discuss them separately. So after coming to this point of conclusion, therefore, when the mind ceases, the prana also ceases. And when the prana ceases, the mind also ceases. Bhagavan then goes on to say, the prana is called, he says, pranan manatin stula rupam enapadam. The mind is called or said to be the gross form of the mind. Because as I say, as soon as ego rises, it projects the body. So the prana is a part of that body consisting of, is one of the five sheaths that constitute the body. So it's a gross form of the mind. And then in the next sentence, Bhagavan says, Marana kalam barel, until the time of death, manan pranane udlil veiti kondirandu. The mind keeps the prana in the body. Udul marekum kalatil, at the time of death, or at the moment of death, or the moment the body dies, udul marekum kalatil, at the moment the body dies, adane kavandu kondu pokirdu. Grasping it, it goes. What it grasps is the prana, and what goes is the mind. So the implication of is until the time of death, the mind keeps the prana in the body. And at the moment the body dies, the mind grasps the prana and it departs. So in other words, it takes the prana along with it. What is the meaning of this? That is, we see when a body dies, the breathing stops. So how can the mind take the breathing with it? That is, because the nature of the mind is to experience a body as I, and it always experiences a living body as I, so the mind has a natural inclination to breathe. That is, when we take a body as I, and that inclination, that vasana to breathe and to live, we bring along with us, so to speak. So it's not actually the gross form of the breathing that we take with us. It is the inclination to live and to breathe that we take with us. In other words, it's the vasana that causes us to live and breathe that we take with us when we leave this body. That is the implication of that. And then in the final sentence of this paragraph, Bhagavan concludes, Ahayal, therefore, pranayamam manam adaka sahayome andri. Therefore, pranayama is just an aid to restrain the mind, to restrain the mind, or to make it temporarily cease, subside, or disappear. Manonasam sayadu, but will not bring about manonasa. So what Bhagavan concludes here is pranayama is an aid to restrain the mind, and it can even bring about a temporary dissolution. He doesn't say it here, but the implication is it can even bring about a temporary dissolution of the mind in Nirvikalpa Samadhi or Manolaya, but it cannot bring about manonasa. So however much pranayama you do, you cannot bring about manonasa. That's why Bhagavan said in verse 14 of Upadeshundya, that I read earlier, but only when one sends the mind, which becomes calm when one restrains the breath, on the investigating path will its form perish. So pranayama alone cannot bring about the destruction of the mind. In order to bring about the destruction of the mind, we need to send it on the investigating path. In other words, we need to direct our attention back within. So that is the paragraph as Bhagavan originally wrote it, which is based on the answers that he gave to Sri Prakasham Pillai. He did, in many places, he refined what Sri Prakasham Pillai had recorded. Here, I don't know, I haven't compared it for some time, but this is more or less what he said to Sri Prakasham Pillai. However, as I said, sometime around the mid-1930s or so, 3 more sentences were added. After the sentence, therefore, when the mind ceases, the breath also ceases, and when the prana also ceases, and when the prana ceases, the mind also ceases. After that, 3 sentences were added. those three sentences, why I don't include them in the main body of the paragraph, but discuss them separately, is they are not actually the direct teachings of Bhagavan. Bhagavan may have answered like this to suit the mentality, the level of understanding of some person. And when Bhagavan answered like this, someone would have recorded and said, oh, Bhagavan, can't we add this in here? Bhagavan say, yes, you can add it if you want. So I think that's how these sentences came to be interpreted. It was in Bhagavan's lifetime that these were added, but just because something is added in Bhagavan's lifetime doesn't mean that it's the main teaching of Bhagavan. Because if someone wanted to add it, Bhagavan says, okay, yes, you add it. Suit yourself. So what he says in these, that is, as I say, these three sentences were added after the sentence in which Bhagavan says, Ahayal manam adangum podu prananam. Therefore, when the mind ceases, the breath also implies ceases. Pranam adangum podu manamam adangam. When the prana ceases, the breath also ceases. So we can assume some devotee would have objected. No, Bhagavan, how can you say like that? Because in sleep, the mind subsides or dissolves back into its source. But we see people when they're sleeping, they don't stop breathing. The body continues breathing. So anyone who asks such a question doesn't understand the basic, the core teaching of Bhagavan, which is that the body of a sleeping person only exists in the view of a waking person. Have any of us seen our body when we're asleep? No, we don't. Because the body, according to Bhagavan, our present state is just a dream. So in a dream, whatever we see in a dream, it exists only in our perception. So when we don't see it, it doesn't exist. So if our present state is also a dream, we should understand this body, that a general belief is, when I sleep, my body is lying comfortably in bed and it's continuing to breathe. But if this is actually a dream, as Bhagavan says it is, then what happens to our body when we're asleep? There is no body because we're not seeing it. It seems to exist only when we see it. When we don't see it, it doesn't exist at all. That is the core teaching of Bhagavan, but not everyone was ready to understand that. So someone would have raised this objection. So Bhagavan would have answered in this way. So what he says in the first of the three interpolated sentences is, I don't doubt that Bhagavan would have given this answer. It's not that someone has just added an idea of their own, because Bhagavan often gave teachings at different levels to suit people of different levels of understanding. So if someone is not ready to accept that our present state is just a dream, that objection is a perfectly reasonable objection. No, we see the body continues breathing even when it's asleep. So Bhagavan said, so the answer Bhagavan would have given to such a person was what's said in these three sentences. The first one, Anal shushuptil manam adangir irundu podilum pranam adanga vilai. That means, however, in sleep, even though the mind has ceased or subsided or dissolved, the prana does not cease. And then in the next sentence, he says, Dehatim padukapin nimitamum. That's one reason. That is, it is for the purpose of protecting the body. Deha manadu marindu vittudo endru pira ayam ayura vannam, and so that other people do not wonder, do not doubt or wonder whether the body has died. Ivaru Ishwara Nyetyal Epatiru. It is arranged thus, it's arranged in such a way by the ordinance of God, for the purpose of protecting the body and so that other people do not wonder whether the body has died. And then in the third sentence, he says, to bring it back to the subject he was talking about, because that's a digression. And for those who understand his core teachings properly, it's an unnecessary digression. So to bring it back to the subject, he says, Jagritilum samadhilum manam adangu kirapodu pranan adangu kiridu. When the mind ceases, subsides or disappears in waking and in samadhi, the prana ceases. Samadhi here, it's referring to a state of manolaya, that is nirvikalpa samadhi. A yogi in nirvikalpa samadhi, their breath will, it doesn't cease entirely, but they maybe have one short breath every minute or something. Even said some yogis can slow down their heart rate to one heartbeat a minute or something. I don't know exactly what the numbers are, but it is possible for those who are proficient in pranayama and other yogic practices to bring about, to reduce the rate of breathing and heart rate and all other physiological functions to an extremely slow rate. So that's why Bhagavan says, when the mind ceases in waking and in samadhi, when the mind ceases or subsides, that we can see that, as I said, a simple example is if you hear some shocking news and for a moment you're so shocked, the breathing actually stops. It may not be for very long, it may be only for half a minute or something, but you're so taken aback, the shock of the news takes your breath away, as we say. To the extent that the mind subsides, to that extent the prana will also subside. And then I just, this notes actually I give him on my website after this paragraph, I just say these three sentences were not in the manuscript of this essay, handwritten by Bhagavan, which was reproduced in the Mountain Path, June 1993, pages 44 to 47, nor were they included either in the essay version of the first edition of 1931 of Sri Ramana Maharshi, Tamil collected works of Bhagavan, or in the 1932 edition of either the 30 or the 28 question and answer versions. I could not find them in any versions published prior to that I have seen, nor in any of Shiva Prakashan Pillai's notebooks. The earliest edition in which I've seen them included was the 1936 edition of the 28 question and answer version, so it was probably added first in that version and later in this essay version. And then I go on, that's just some historical detail, and then I go and say, according to Bhagavan's core teachings, the body and world are both mental creations, so they seem to exist only so long as they're perceived by ego, which is the root and core of the mind, and hence they do not exist when the mind has subsided in sleep. For those who are willing to accept this teaching, the idea that in sleep, even though the mind has ceased, the prana does not cease, is not an issue. Because if the existence of the body, and hence of the prana that animates it, is dependent upon the existence of the mind, it is clear that in sleep, when the mind ceases, the prana also ceases, as he said explicitly in the previous sentence. Therefore, if these three interpolated sentences were something that Bhagavan actually said, which he probably did, he presumably said so in reply to someone who objected to the previous sentence, arguing that when a person is sleeping, others can see him or her breathing, in which case he would have said this as a concession to their limited understanding, seeing that they were not willing to accept his teaching that the body, prana, world, and all other phenomena seem to exist only in the view of ego, and hence they cease to exist when the mind ceases to exist, as in dreamless sleep.